Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Michael Kirby. Now I should pause for a moment and give his full title here. This is Justice Michael Kirby, and this is important for the discussion we're going to have today. On the 21st of March 2013, the United Nations Human Rights Council passed Resolution 2213. Now what this mandated was the setting up of a commission to investigate reports of systemic, widespread and grave violations of human rights within North Korea. The special rapporteur for this inquiry was Marzuki Darusman. Co-chairing the commission was Sonia Bezerko from Serbia, and our guest today, Michael Kirby from Australia. Now, Michael Kirby came to this commission after 34 years serving as a judge within Australia. And after a year-long investigation, in 2014, the commission tabled its report, under which it charged North Korea with crimes against humanity in 9 specific areas, and leveled those responsible at all levels of society, from ordinary prison guards to the institutions to the upper echelons of the regime. These crimes involve the violations of freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, discrimination, violations of freedom of movement, the rights to food, arbitrary detention, torture, the imposition of concentration camps, and the violation of the right to life. When the charges came down, they were labelled as ongoing and intrinsic to the fabric of the state. So what the international community was faced with was a realization of what many people had been ignoring for a long time, or willfully avoiding, was that North Korea was abusing the human rights of its citizens at a level and for a duration that had no parallel in the world. And the commission was based in solid legal grounding. North Korea, though not accepting of many of the international community's human rights treaties, were signatories to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. And this goes beyond their already existing obligations under the UN Charter. But this is half the story. The process and the interaction with North Korea is incredibly telling. As you would with any investigation, this commission and Michael Kirby tried to access North Korea. They repeatedly asked for access to people, to sites, and to information. And at every turn, the North Koreans simply ignored the requests, which of course offered up a unique challenge. So public hearings were held. Submissions were sent out for people to come forward and offer information. And of course, there are no shortage of North Korean defectors who have left the country and are now living in different places around the world. But still, the response was overwhelming. And as Michael Kirby would tell us, eventually, they were so flooded with people and personal testimony that simply due to time constraints, they had to eventually stop the hearings and limit some of the testimony. North Korea responded by labeling these people, these witnesses, human scum, and dismissing the whole enterprise as a human rights racket. But what Michael Kirby and the commission built here was a series of findings on North Korea's human rights and the responsibility of their government and their regime. A database had been constructed of crimes, of perpetrators, and of witness testimony that in turn corroborated other witness testimony and matched evidence that could be seen from satellite imagery. So despite the slurs, despite the attacks, and despite the lack of cooperation, North Korea had the charge of systemic human rights violations laid upon it in a way that we hadn't seen before, and with the legitimacy of the international community behind it. This had implications for Kim Jong-un. It had implications for countries like China that many people saw as protecting North Korea within the Security Council and by propping up the regime through sanctions avoidance. Now the Commission had a whole set of recommendations involving the Security Council, involving an implicit referral to the International Criminal Court, and of the future means by which the international community should follow up on North Korea's human rights landscape. Michael Kirby was there. He ran the hearings. He collated the report, and he delivered the findings. And all this, as well as Michael Kirby's interaction with representatives from the North Korean government, can be found online. The archives are openly available, including the witness testimony and the public discussions. Ordinarily, I like to do longer podcasts, somewhere around the hour mark. But Michael Kirby, even in his retirement, is quite busy. So we had to limit this down to around a half an hour. So if anyone is interested in digging deeper into the topics that we discuss, I will put a link below to the Commission of Inquiry findings and to Michael Kirby's personal website. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached below, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. So, without any further delay, this is Justice Michael Kirby. Justice Michael Kirby, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thank you for speaking with me.
So, of course, today we're going to be speaking about the Commission of Inquiry and your role in this. So just as a very brief introduction, what was the Commission of Inquiry and how did you yourself find yourself in charge of this?
The Commission of Inquiry was a step up in the responses of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. That is the most senior body of the United Nations that deals with issues of human rights. Complaints had been made for many years about North Korea. A special rapporteur had been appointed, but he had received no cooperation from North Korea, and thus a decision was eventually made in 2013 to establish a commission of inquiry. Doing that is a distinct step up in the seriousness with which the Human Rights Council is dealing in regards the matter. But interestingly, in this case alone, the adoption of the motion establishing the Commission of Inquiry was carried without any call for a vote, and that is an indication of the strong feeling that was around in the Human Rights Council. The mandate of the Commission of Inquiry established by the motion was broad-ranging. It required the people conducting the inquiry to look at all of the complaints about human rights abuses, but particularly to examine those complaints which rose to the level of a crime against humanity, that being one of the most serious crimes in international law. So that the Commission of Inquiry was then established. I was not in charge of it. I was a member of it and the chairman of it, but the members of the Commission are all independent. They're independent of the political process of the Human Rights Council, and they're also independent of each other. As it happened, the three commissioners reached agreement on the matters in the mandate and on their report. The other two commissioners were Marzuki Darusman, who was the special rapporteur on North Korea and who had been the Attorney General of Indonesia, and Sonia Beserko, who was a human rights expert and an expert on genocide from Serbia. So we three formed the Commission of Inquiry. We were given until March of 2014 to deliver our report. We delivered our report on time, within budget, and unanimously. And I think it's fair to say that when it was delivered, it created something of a sensation in the Human Rights Council and then eventually in the General Assembly because of the methodology which we adopted. That was a methodology unlike most United Nations inquiries of conducting public hearings, which is the Anglo-American way of conducting public hearings. It's not the way that most commissions of inquiry of the United Nations undertake their work, but it was the way we did, and I think it was a good antidote to the secrecy and lack of transparency of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea.
So one of the other ways in which it was also well received, of course, and I take it from your work that you deliberately planned it this way, or at least the Commission deliberately planned it this way, was for the report to be well written. And this may sound like a trivial point, but it is actually quite important for the report to be easily accessible in this way.
One of the problems in preparing United Nations reports, which is nobody's particular fault, is that there are limited languages of the United Nations, but the summary of the report has to be prepared in each of the five languages of the United Nations, and not everybody speaks those languages. One of those languages is the English language, and I was the only native speaker of the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea whose mother tongue was English. Therefore, I should say that my colleagues also spoke excellent English, as did the members of the Secretariat who were appointed to work with us. They were an independent secretariat. Some of them had been officers of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, but necessarily, if you're writing in a language other than your own, some of the expressions will not be entirely comfortable as they will be for a native speaker. So I took on myself the responsibility, with the encouragement of my colleagues, to weigh every word in the report. I believe the report does read very well. In fact, I believe the report is a page-turner, and a great pity of the methodology of the United Nations is that whilst it is very good in setting up these inquiries, it is not so effective in publishing the reports and in getting them out into the general market of ideas. I think that's a big disadvantage. The report on North Korea should have been published in such a way as it could be bought at international airports and read by the mass of the general public, because it is a chilling tale of very grim stories, and it's made them more effective because of our methodology, and in particular the methodology that involved the use of public hearings and therefore of testimony by witnesses, which were then cut up and used as appropriate to illustrate the points that the Commission was making and to give life and colour to the complaints of individuals who came to the United Nations and complained about the shocking ways in which they and their families had been treated in North Korea.
So there's a whole series of findings from this, and we will go through them in detail here, but just there are some themes that seem to underscore a lot of these crimes, at least in a very unique way to the North Korean context. And some of these things are Sonban, which is I suppose, the caste system inside North Korea, and things like crimes against women that people often overlook for more, I suppose glossy is the wrong word, but more eye-catching crimes. But these sort of things seem to undercut a lot of what was going on inside North Korea, this systemic sort of harm from cradle to grave.
And not only Songbun, the caste system, as you've said, and crimes against women, but other areas which really got virtually no coverage in the international media when the report was delivered, and didn't seem to pick up a lot of attention. I think actually that the best chapter in the report is the chapter on food. The provision of sufficient food for a population is self-evidently one of the most pressing and important obligations of any government anywhere. The system in North Korea was complicated by the fact that in previous decades the system had been one of the use of coupons, which is familiar to an Australian, because of my age at least, because during the Second World War we also had a coupon system to ration the availability of essential foods, but that was abolished soon after the end of the Second World War. In North Korea, in a Soviet-style economy, the coupons were kept, but eventually that system broke down, but there was no market system to take its place, and therefore there were very great shortages of food. Those shortages were exacerbated by the other defects of the economy, the lack of outlets for a market system, such as had developed in China, for example, and in the Russian Federation. But on top of that, there were serious problems arising from natural disasters, from floods and then droughts, and the combination of all this was that in the mid-1990s, a terrible famine arose that cost hundreds of thousands of North Koreans their lives, and that itself was a most grievous crime against humanity and the most terrible human rights crime, which is brought to notice in the chapter of the report on food. It's a very grim, but it's also a readable chapter, and it's illustrated with horrifying tales of suffering by people who had come to our public hearings, and also by statistical and other information, some of it from North Korea itself, but others from United Nations food agencies and donor agencies. And food is an endemic problem that recurs in North Korea, and it deserves more attention from a humanitarian point of view than it has received.
And when you charge North Korea with crimes against humanity in all these different categories, there's a couple of interesting phrases that came across here. So at least the report mentioned that they were intrinsic to the state and ongoing in nature. And this is important for people because most times you get these violations, they happen in times of civil war and when a state begins to destruct from within. But this has been a 70-year systemic system of these sort of crimes.
It's true that at the heart of the problem of North Korea was and is the failure of the governmental system. They have no modern, accountable, responsive system of governance for their people. This is itself an offence against international human rights law, but it's one which is a kind of leftover, possibly the only real leftover from the days of the Soviet Union and its allies, and that has not changed. There have been little changes at the margins. For example, during the mid-1990s, with the great shortage of food and other essentials of living, women started to set up tables in town squares to sell items that they owned in order to get food and necessities for their children and the families. And that was a step which, by the way, was strongly resisted by the military when it began to happen, which has continued and has ameliorated the situation of the economy of North Korea. But the essential problem remains the same. This is a country which, by remarkable technological developments, has produced at least 20 nuclear weapons and extremely sophisticated missile delivery systems, but which doesn't feed its people properly and doesn't provide systems of governance that are accountable to the people, and doesn't allow access to free or even semi-free media, that doesn't permit access to the internet for any but the most elite members of the population, that suppresses political freedoms, that forbids in most parts of the country religious freedoms, that is paranoid about external influences, and all of this in a country with extremely sophisticated weapons of mass destruction. So it's sitting there as a potential threat not only to itself and its own citizens, but to its immediate neighbours. Never forget that Seoul, the capital city of the Republic of Korea, South Korea, is just 100 miles from North Korea and within range of old-fashioned rockets and military arsenal, let alone the missile delivery systems and nuclear warheads that have been developed in more recent times.
So with all these charges coming forward, there has been a question in the media, and of course this is going to lead into some further questions here. Why was the charge crimes against humanity, and why wasn't the label genocide applied to these particular crimes?
Crimes against humanity were charges which the Commission of Inquiry, which was extremely careful and one might say legalistic in the approach it took to its duties in respect of particular items, and the Commission of Inquiry made findings of reasonable arguability concerning a very large number of crimes of human rights crimes against international law, a smaller list of crimes against humanity, and it rejected as unproved the charge that was advanced to us by submissions that we received from civil society that North Korea was guilty of genocide. Genocide has become something of a gold standard objective of those who make complaints of international human rights crimes to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. But the definition of genocide is not at large. The definition for the purposes of a body operating within the United Nations is the Genocide Convention of 1948. Interestingly, because we are approaching the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations very close in point of time to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And there were debates on the committee which formulated the Genocide Convention of 1948, which argued that to establish genocide, it should be sufficient to find that a population or part of a population had been targeted and suffered gross crimes of violence and murder, mass murder, on the basis of political grounds. That argument was advanced by the then government of Cuba and strongly debated during the preparation of the Genocide Convention. The United States of America at that time opposed the expansion of the idea of genocide, which was a comparatively new word and new concept, but which grew directly out of the crimes of the Nazis in the Second World War and in Germany and the countries occupied by the Third Reich. So that the actual definition of genocide that emerged from the Genocide Convention of 1948 was this. It was that there are grave crimes of violence perpetrated as a matter of state policy against a population or part of a population on the grounds of race, ethnicity, nationality, or religion. If you pause and think of the crimes of genocide that were perpetrated against the Jewish people and other minorities, including prisoners of war under the Nazis, then they fitted into that definition. But the Cuban proposal at the time that it should also be on the basis of the actual or presumed political beliefs of the population or part of the population concerned should be included. That proposal was not accepted by the General Assembly when it completed its work on the Genocide Convention. Therefore, when we looked at the evidence, we could see plenty of evidence in the case of North Korea that a population or part of the population had been suffering grave crimes of violence and many had been killed. But the critical question was, has this happened on the grounds of race, ethnicity, nationality, or religion? And the answer to that question that we reached was, the evidence doesn't prove on the basis of reasonable arguability, which was the normal standard, which we accepted, that the motivation for the violence against the population or part of the population was on those grounds. Accordingly, we concluded that it may be that when full access is given to North Korea in due course of time, it might provide evidence that establishes genocide, but we did not feel that that evidence had been provided to us, and therefore we found that the crime of genocide had not been proved. All of this simply goes to demonstrate the great care with which the Commission of Inquiry conducted its inquiry. We were not just a group of NGOs or representatives of NGOs deciding a matter on political or geopolitical grounds. That was not our task. We were deciding a legal question, and in the case of genocide, we concluded that the evidence did not allow us to reach a conclusion that North Korea was guilty of genocide. That has proved a controversial question. Some people say we should have pushed the boundaries of the definition of genocide in international law. Some people have suggested that we took too narrow a view. But it does illustrate, I hope, that we were not conducting this inquiry as a lynch mob. We were not there to just say the nastiest things we could possibly say against North Korea. There were plenty of horrible crimes that we could elaborate, and we did. But we didn't push the envelope. We kept within the strict letter of international law, and I think that's another reason, apart from our methodology, as to why the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea had great credibility in the international community. And I believe it is that credibility that has assisted in the Security Council, to which the report of the Commission of Inquiry was sent, in securing the votes of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China eventually to impose ever-increasing sanctions on North Korea, because the combination of a state that is performing these terrible wrongs against its own people with the development of nuclear warheads and sophisticated intercontinental missiles is extremely dangerous, not only to the people of North Korea, not only to the people of South Korea, but also to the adjoining states of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China.
So one of the points that you mentioned there, and this is very important, and this is a question, in fact, that Sandra Fahy wanted me to put to you. She herself has worked with a lot of defectors and defector testimony. And this is the challenge you had of access to the country. And this comes up again and again and again. So you sought access to North Korea and were denied at every single turn. And I suppose the question is, how common is this sort of denial of access? And what do you think about the idea that first you were asked for access to the country, you were denied that access, and one of the charges that North Korea brought back to you after your finding was you never spoke to anyone inside North Korea itself?
This is a self-fulfilling condemnation by North Korea. They don't allow access. The only access that is permitted, except on their terms, is a very regimented and small tourism access. And even that is subject to extremely severe limitations, as the young Mr. Otto Warmbier from the United States found when he took a banner off a wall to show his friends back in the United States, and that was regarded as a most serious crime and resulted in his imprisonment and eventually his contracting a very severe condition, and he's being shipped home to the United States dying, where he eventually, or not long after, died. So we sought access. It's not entirely true to say we were denied it. They simply ignored our request. They ignored it, and they ignored the Commission of Inquiry, and they thought that that was the best strategy they could adopt to undermine the credibility of the Commission of Inquiry. Many countries that are the subject of United Nations Commissions of Inquiry will deny access to the Commission in the areas under their control. Sometimes, as in Syria, they may not be under control of the whole territory of the country, but North Korea was under very strict control of its territory, with the third largest standing army in the world for a population of 23 million people, which is approximately the same population as the Commonwealth of Australia, and with nuclear warheads and missile systems. So they just ignored our request, but that didn't create a problem in the peculiar circumstances of North Korea. In North Korea, for the past 30 years, there's been a trickle and eventually a flood of people seeking to escape from North Korea, and a significant number of people who succeed in escaping through escape lines that generally run through China, some through Mongolia, and that meant that in the Republic of Korea, South Korea, to which escapees can come and claim South Korean nationality under the Constitution of South Korea, there were 30,000 people who were in very large numbers not only happy to give evidence to the Commission of Inquiry, but in very significant numbers anxious to give testimony before us. Therefore, we had no problem getting testimony. We advertised our presence and the willingness to receive testimony. We were then swamped by people who came to give testimony and offered to do so. We had to be particularly careful in the case of identification and publicity to people who still had families in North Korea, but we had no problem getting testimony. We had no difficulty gathering testimony. In the end, we had to cut off the people who were coming because we just had too many, and we had to get our report done in a space effectively of a little more than 6 months. And that is what we had to do, and that is what we did. We were extremely efficient in the way we went about our work. We had public hearings in Seoul, in Tokyo, in London, in Washington, D.C., and we had a session in Bangkok, Thailand. So in the key places where there are escapees, called defectors by some people, they came forward, and we had no problems getting testimony. There was one witness, Mr. Shin, whose testimony was brought to the attention of his father. His father then went on television in North Korea and condemned his son, said he was lying. Mr. Shin admitted that in some respects his testimony had not been fully truthful. He gave various explanations for that. That is not uncommon in escapee testimony generally, but overwhelmingly his testimony was corroborated by other witnesses, and in substance, though not in some particular aspects of the detail, we were convinced that he was telling basically the truth. So though North Korea criticized us, the answer was the answer we gave. Let us come in. We will acknowledge if any mistakes have been made. We will be the first to acknowledge it. Or if you don't let us come in, let other trusted international observers enter North Korea, go to the places which have been identified as the detention centers, and which are apparently identifiable on international satellite imagery, and let international trusted inspectors check the facts that we have recorded.
I mean, I suppose on that, I should ask the question, if you were given access and if you were allowed to access sites, just for people listening, who would you like to speak to? What would you like to access? This gives a picture of what specifically you were denied access to.
Well, I don't really think this is a big issue. I know North Korea makes it a big issue, but given the veracity, credibility, and convincing testimony that was given by very large numbers, and that there are 30,000 of them in South Korea, I really don't think this is a big issue. This is essentially the one nation. It's divided into two countries by a line imposed on a map, drawn by somebody who knew nothing about Korea, dividing a people who have been united for centuries. So the fact that we had to get some of the people who are now living in South Korea and elsewhere is really immaterial. But what one would do would be to go first, you would go to the detention centers, because the very large numbers of people who are detained present an immediate and serious danger to human rights, and that is something that we would have done first up, but we would simply have ticked off our list. We had a list of 9 matters which the Human Rights Council of the United Nations asked us to investigate. That is what we investigated, and if we were given access, we would come and go through that 9. As a second best solution, we did offer to North Korea, after the report was produced, to come up into North Korea and answer questions. We would conduct a question and answer session in North Korea, but that they refused to do. Essentially, their defense was that which was expressed by their ambassador in Geneva when the report was tabled in the Human Rights Council. He said, "We have in our country a saying, mind your own business." Well, the answer which the international community, the Charter of the United Nations, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and all the other human rights treaties gives, is that the state of grave human rights abuses in a country is now part of the business of humanity, because we realize from the experience of the Second World War and the grave crimes against humanity that it is part of the problem of great dangers, existential dangers, which are presented by states that have weapons of mass destruction and that suppress dissent in their own country, and that is the state that exists in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
So as a very final question here, the report has been out for a few years now, so I might get you to reflect back on it. There was a whole series of recommendations in the final chapter, and of course a whole series of geopolitical events have happened since then. So looking back now, what are your thoughts on the report itself, and what are your hopes for the future of North Korean human rights?
Well, I stand back from the situation in North Korea and look at our report on DPRK as an example of what the United Nations is there to do. It is there to investigate not just North Korea, but other countries which are perpetrating extremely serious crimes against humanity, war crimes, and humanitarian offences and genocide against their own people. At a meeting of the General Assembly in 2005, heads of state from all over the country, all over the world, agreed that where an individual country fails to protect the fundamental rights of its people, the responsibility shifts to the whole of humanity to give answer. And therefore, looking back, I think that is where we still are. The international community has promised to give answer in the light of what happened to the victims of genocide and other crimes against humanity in the Second World War. The international community has promised that it will not look away, that it will not, as it did at Evian and during and before the Second World War, simply ignore the reports of terrible crimes, but it will respond. And unfortunately, the international community is now proceeding to deal only with the issue of security of North Korea. That's an extremely serious issue, and it's also a human rights issue. But it's not the only issue. There is also the grave issue of human rights as revealed by the Commission of Inquiry of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And to the extent that we ignore that we don't even put it on the table in order to reach a so-called deal with North Korea, and that we accept as that deal that there will be a move towards a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, as if that is the only serious issue of concern before the world. Well, we are ignoring our own obligations as promised in the international crimes and in the Charter and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I hope that we will return to responding to the report of the Commission of Inquiry, because that report is still before the world community and it is still not answered.
And for people listening, that report can be found online, as well as all the witness testimony as well, and the interactions between Justice Michael Kirby and the DPRK representatives. So on that note, Justice Michael Kirby, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.